Between my Kasumi profile picture, pretty explicitly Persona banner, and constant need to reference it, I think it's more than safe to say I'm a Persona fan. And chances are, if you're watching, you're at least passingly interested in the series as well. Whether you've played the games, watched Let's Plays, or have never experienced them whatsoever, you're likely to have heard that it's so easy to lose hours of your life to these games, and I think this couldn't be more true. Between the 3 main series Persona games I've played, I've easily clocked in well over 400 hours. I haven't even been a fan for that long myself, so I've never experienced the initial release of an entry. But with Persona 3 Reload on the horizon, I figured I'd talk about how each of these games creates such a deeply immersive experience, touch on each individual entry's unique immersion building aspects, and why I love each of them for different reasons. Just to note, this video will be more on the daily life aspect rather than the dungeon crawling RPG stuff, so strap in and let's finally talk about Persona. For starters, Persona isn't itself without its presentation. Everything from the UI to the music contribute to that immersive feeling. An incredibly important and often under-recognized aspect of any JRPG is good menuing. And I'd say Persona hasn't always been the greatest. It certainly can feel a little clunky, especially in 3, but it's safe to say modern Persona feels incredibly intuitive to menu through, making you spend less time menuing and more time experiencing, which is really important for immersion. This even relates to the game's theme colors. In 5, the overlays during daily life segments are completely black and white. There isn't much red anywhere to be seen, yet in the dungeon crawling, battles, and menus, everything is absolutely plastered in that iconic P5 red. This makes a player associate the black and white with the sort of monotony of the high school life, and the red with the party's secret phantom thief escapades, which are way more exciting or at least vibrant. In Persona 3, every single of the aspect of the UI is covered in blue, but the overlay turns green during the dark hour. Considering you spend more time looking at the blue overlay, the dark hour feels a bit weird because the elements you're used to seeing in one way look different. Something as small as this helps get the player into the mind of the protagonist. I mean, of course the dark hour is meant to be weird, it's not natural. The UI also keeps important information on the screen at all times. In 5, you always see the deadline for defeating the next target. In 4, you always see the weather, and the forecast for the next few days is easily accessible through the TV overlay. And in 3, the moon's phase always looms in the corner, with the counter showing how many days until it's full. Little things like these make it easy for the player to get lost in the headspace of the protagonist, and really emphasize the importance of managing your time effectively. You always know when you have to get back in the dungeon, so you always know how long you have to prepare. And making the player's use of time feel important makes them feel more invested, because their choices then feel important. The great OSTs these games have been talked about to death, but they're pretty important too. Music that's grading can really detract from the experience, and having so many songs to fit so many specific situations really helps distinguish them in your brain. I personally really love how the weather can dictate the BGM in Persona 4, or how 5's Beneath the Mask has 4 different versions. It's such minor details which work wonders to distinguish the games from their contemporaries. The soundtrack being not only good but fitting for so many situations make the game much more satisfying to me. I love Dragon Quest XI, but by the game's last act, some of the songs began to drive me absolutely insane. I've never had this experience playing Persona. I think with any game, the most important aspect to building a sense of immersion is, of course, the gameplay. I love these games, and The unique gameplay experience is definitely part of the reason I do. Of course, I love turn-based combat. Most of my favorite games use it, and it's just something I've always identified with. However, the immersion brought on by the daily life sections is really what sets Persona apart from its contemporaries. Lots of JRPGs are implementing the calendar system, but none with the same level of quality as Persona, and this kinda makes you wonder why. I've played and absolutely loved Fire Emblem Three Houses, but its daily life aspect feels so much worse than Persona's. Persona meshes the perfect balance of giving adequate weight to each use of time while still not making some uses more obviously valuable than others. I could choose to work on social links, but why not social stats? Why not get money or grind levels? The player is constantly forced to make decisions which will have consequences later in the game. But the games also don't put too much pressure on the player to always make the optimal decision. Different players will have a different approach to managing their time, and this element of personalization to each save file, as well as the player always having to think without being too stressed, are big contributors to Persona's immersion. The games would be drastically worse if the player was given way more time than they need, because that would devalue the daily life portions of the game. But if the games were too strict with time, the player wouldn't be able to extract any comfort from such portions, which ultimately serve as not only essential gameplay, but also a break from the constant dungeon crawling and battles. When I was getting into the series, I kept hearing about how strict Persona 3 was with its time management, and if you don't appreciate it with enough thought, it can certainly feel that way, but for me, Persona 3 struck a really satisfying balance. The anxiety I had going into that experience was completely misplaced, and it ended up being incredible. I specifically played Persona 5 Royal and found that in the game's extra content at the end, I completely ran out of stuff to do. All the confidants I'd cared about, I'd completed. All the ones I didn't care about, I couldn't complete. And my stats were already built. I had more money than I knew what to do with, and I found myself lost with way more time than I needed. As great as the third semester's writing was, that aspect to it really distracted from my experience with it. Ultimately, the player will spend more time in daily life than in dungeons, so it's really important to add some variation to the daily life segments. Social events are the perfect brief breaks to what could be monotonous, seemingly endless social sync gameplay. I've recently rewatched a few of the events of Persona 4, and some of my fondest memories of playing through come from these events. In theory, they're just cutscenes with little or no plot relevance, but the nuggets of characterization, world building, and just selling the idea that the protagonist and their party are genuine friends serve these games so well. It's a big reason why I love Persona 4 as much as I do. The events are so entertaining and serve to show just how little there really is to do in Inaba. One of the game's most memorable moments for me is when the party meets up to eat a watermelon. It's such a non-occasion. They meet up to eat a fruit, but it feels like one of those silly memories you have of eating snacks with friends in years gone by. I think if media can invoke the feeling of nostalgia on first viewing, I think that signals immersion and quality. This wouldn't be nearly as effective if these events didn't feel so human too. Characters bounce off each other, go on tangents, make jokes that don't land, and some that do. It's so human, and feels so great. And it can really make the player feel like they're there. Speaking of writing, the core of Persona is in its characters and characterization. If the characters weren't so likable or memorable, there would be much less incentive to pursue social links with them. Though there is gameplay reward to social links, they are certainly not mandatory if the player doesn't really like the character. The quality of the character writing makes the game feel way more real. Not only does it make the player care more about their actions and the actual plot if they're present in it, but it also leads them to grow attached to them, and truly care about what they have to say in social links. If you don't care about these characters and couldn't get immersed in this world, then the aspect of social links could be removed entirely and replaced with nothing but a flat number value like a stat that goes up. The fact that social links are behind characters who you may or may not be endeared to makes it feel way more real. Real people sometimes have to deal with people they don't like, and in Persona, sometimes you may have to progress a social link you're not too fond of just for the benefits, or pursue benefits you don't need just to further the character you like's story. The emotional response invoked by these characters are a crucial part of how people feel about these games. Whether you love or hate Akechi, almost everyone remembers him better than most of the characters in Persona 5. Kamoshida is a much more interesting villain than Shido despite being way less relevant, and is often remembered because his actions not only directly hurt your dear party members An and Ryuji, but his character also hits much more close to home than a villain on the scale of Shido. While we don't all have physically abusive teachers, it's much easier to comprehend than a tyrant controlling a nation from the shadows like some kind of One Piece villain. Kamoshida is much more hateable as an individual, while someone like Shido, you're more prone to hate theoretically. I can talk about my opinions on Persona's villains, be they Strega, Shido, or the quote-unquote true villains from P4 or Royal, but I don't think I need to do that in this video. And hey, maybe I will in another. In any case, more than anything else, these games are incredibly charming, and I don't think I will ever find anything quite like it. I mean, yeah, I'm super excited for Metaphor ReFantasio, but I don't expect it to be like another Persona for me. And Persona 3 Reload's on the horizon and looking really promising. But I think in a world like ours, a game like Persona that manages to just take you out of everything and all the stretches of life and just remind you to take your time is really special. I mean, Persona's made me reevaluate the way I see relationships, and to an extent, made me realize that each day is as important as the last and the next. At the end of the day, all that matters is having fun. So, take your time, slow down, and maybe subscribe. Thanks for watching.